First story. My story began the moment I decided to spend the evening at a club. Even though I was not a frequent visitor to such places, I wanted to relax and be with friends. I decided to allow myself a little break from everyday life, but my inner voice still made me think about the money, which I did not have enough for such entertainment. In the club, I tried to ignore the price of drinks and fun, trying to enjoy the moment. But over time, the money in my wallet disappeared faster than I could have imagined. I started to feel clumsy and awkward, realizing that there wouldn't be enough money for the whole evening. When I finally decided to leave the club, I felt tired and depressed. I got into my car and went home. On the way, I realized that there was much less fuel left in the tank than I had imagined. I stopped at a gas station, but it turned out that it was already closed and there was no gasoline available. Deciding that I could still get to the nearest gas station, I continued driving along the highway, hoping for the best. The night was quiet, and there were almost no cars on the road. However, my situation quickly worsened when the fuel tank indicator on the control panel indicated that I was almost out of gas. I stopped in the middle of the highway, knowing that in this situation it was necessary to take some action. I got out of the car and started waving to passing drivers, hoping for help. But every car passed me, as if I didn't exist. Just when my nerves began to fail and I felt alone and helpless in the middle of the night, a car headlight appeared on the horizon. The car was approaching me, and its driver stopped next to me. The man in the SUV offered to help me, and I gladly accepted his offer. But when I got into his car, something in his gaze made me feel uncomfortable. He smiled, but his smile was somehow artificial. As soon as we started moving, the man began asking strange questions and acting ridiculously. My anxiety grew by the minute, and I felt like I had made a huge mistake getting into that car. But now that we were on the move, I could do nothing but try to keep my cool and consider my options for getting out of this strange situation. The man, the driver of the cruiser, continued to ask strange questions, and his behavior became more and more aggressive and intimidating. He started threatening me, saying that he would destroy me and steal my money. My panic grew with every second, and I realized that I needed to somehow get out of this nightmare situation. I decided to pretend to be calm and pretend that I agreed with him to protect myself. There was a furious fight for survival inside me, and I realized that all my driving experience and skills suddenly became focused on how to get out of this situation. At some point, when the man was distracted, I decisively opened the door and rushed outside, straight onto the moving highway. Cars rushed noisily past me, and I knew that only a moment separated me from serious danger. But the alternative was a threat from a man in a cruiser, and I had no other choice. I ran along the road, dodging cars until I was able to get to the nearest car, which turned out to be a couple of students returning from a party. Without explanation, I asked them for help and asked them to drive to the nearest police station. Seeing my hysteria and hearing my story, they agreed to help and contacted the police. When police arrived, they went looking for the man and his SUV. Thanks to the description and license plate number of the car, the man was detained. Police found a knife and drugs in his car, and he was arrested. I was saved, but this terrible experience left a mark on me forever. This night reminded me of how appearances can be deceiving and that safety and caution should always come first, especially when you find yourself in an unfamiliar situation. Second story. This story began after a hard night shift at work. I worked in a small pharmacy in the suburbs, and fatigue had long taken hold of me. When the work shift finally ended and I went home, it was already night outside. The road led through deep forests, and there were practically no other cars on the road. The moon shone brightly, illuminating the road ahead of me. Soon after I left the city, I felt that something was wrong. On the sides of the road, the forest became thicker, and the headlights of my car allowed me to see only a small part of the road in front of me. Through the sound of the wind, a strange murmur suddenly reached me. I turned around, but didn't see anything unusual. Deciding that it was probably just a momentary sound, I continued driving. but the murmur became stronger and closer, as if something was moving along the sides of my car in the forest. A misgiving took hold of me, and I decided to pick up speed. At that moment, something touched the back of my car. I winced and looked in the rearview mirror, but saw nothing. Suddenly, my car started shaking, and something I couldn't describe jumped out of the forest. It was some kind of animal, but unlike any I had ever seen. The animal was huge and rough, with a bony mouth and sharp teeth. It looked like a creature from a nightmare. It attacked my car, trying to get inside through the glass, and let out a piercing scream. I screamed and tried to disperse this creature, but it was too strong and persistent. My car jerked as it grabbed the back of it with its teeth. In desperation, I pulled my knife out of the glove compartment and began to stab the creature, but it was invulnerable. A moment later, the headlights of another car appeared around me and approached mine. The strangers jumped out of the car, armed with flashlights. They began to illuminate the creature, and it let out a scream, then rushed into the forest, disappearing among the trees. These strangers saved me from a monster I couldn't imagine. When they offered me a ride to the nearest gas station, I was more grateful than ever. But the story of what happened that night stayed with me, leaving me with acute pain and horror from meeting an unknown predator that lurked in the darkness of the night. The strangers who saved me from this terrible creature turned out to be local hunters. They told me that such a creature had never been seen in these forests, and it seemed to them something completely alien and incomprehensible. They explained that recently there had been several complaints about the disappearance of domestic animals and even a few forest workers, but no one could explain what was happening. We went together to the nearest police station to report what had happened. The police, after listening to our story, began an investigation. Local news outlets quickly picked up the story, and it became the subject of widespread public concern. Specialists in the field of biology and zoology began research to determine what exactly attacked my car and what else might be hiding in the forests. As time passed, experts came to the conclusion that the creature was a representative of some unknown species, possibly a mutation or the result of genetic manipulation. However, its origin remained a mystery, and no one could give a definitive answer as to how such a creature could appear in these forests. My journey home after my work shift turned into a nightmare, but it also led to the discovery of one of the most unexplained mysteries in the area. My experience remained inexplicable and strange, and although I no longer encountered the mysterious creature, it remained in my memory as a symbol of the unknown horrors that lurk in the dark and deep forests. Third story. It was one of those evenings where long hours at the office left me exhausted and wanting nothing more than to go home and rest. The late hour arrived when I finally finished all my work duties and headed to my car in the parking lot. The night was quiet, and the moon illuminated the deserted streets. As soon as I got onto the highway, I noticed a truck following my car. Looking in the rearview mirror, I noticed that the driver of this truck was a man of about 50, with a gloomy expression on his face. I felt a little uneasy, but I decided that it might just be a coincidence. However, the truck continued to follow me, despite my attempts to change speed and direction. Fear began to take over me when I realized that this man was actually watching my car. To make sure I wasn't panicking unnecessarily, I circled the area a few times, changing direction, but the truck continued to follow me. It was scary. Having suppressed my fear, I decided not to return home, but headed to the nearest police station. Through the windows of my car, I saw that the man driving the truck was beginning to lose his patience. He began to step on the gas and get closer. It became clear to me that my life was in the hands of this stranger, and I did not know how to get out of this situation. The truck's speed increased, and it began to approach my car too quickly. In a panic, I dialed the police station on my mobile phone and described the situation to the operator. She advised me to stay in sight as long as possible and get to the station. Minutes seemed like hours as I fought for my life with this man. Soon, I saw several flashing lights on the horizon and knew the police were close. The truck realized that its actions had been detected and abruptly turned off the road, disappearing into the night. The police caught up with me and began investigating what happened. Although the man was not detained, the police promised to keep an eye on me and warn me against possible threats. This horrific experience left me with deep scars, and I now always carefully follow my car when leaving the office late at night. Over the next few weeks, I felt very tense and watched my every move closely. The police really kept their word and provided me with support and protection. I realized that the man who had been following me was still at large, and this added to my anxiety. However, as I began to feel more calm and secure, something strange happened. I noticed that others began to follow me. Everywhere I went, it seemed as if unfamiliar faces were watching me. This started to scare me even more. One day, I decided to move to another city, hoping that this would help me get rid of intrusive surveillance. In a new place, I started over, found a new job and friends. Everything seemed good until something strange happened. One day, returning home after work, I found a small package on the threshold of my apartment. There was a note inside. "Now you can't go anywhere." This message pierced me with a cold horror, and I realized that an invisible threat was still watching me. The police were powerless to solve this mystery. My friends began to advise me to contact private detectives, but no matter what they did, the investigation did not move forward. I was locked in my own life, feeling like an invisible hand was pushing me against the wall. However, one morning, I woke up to find another package. But this time it only contained an old photograph. It showed me and the man who followed me on the road that night. This was impossible, because he went into the darkness and could not take a picture of me. My heart pounded as I realized that that night and the new threats were just part of a carefully planned game. The invisible enemy seemed to always be one step ahead. He knew how to intimidate me and trapped me forever. My stomach began to burn with fear, and my eyes, looking at the photo, restlessly slid in search of answers. I felt fear run through me and realized that this nightmare was not over yet. Fourth story. Halloween has always been a special holiday for me. That day when ghosts and monsters reign at night, and the streets come alive with a mystical atmosphere. This evening, as always, I went on a journey through the night streets to enjoy the magic of Halloween. My car drove me through deserted streets strewn with the remnants of the departed hordes of vampires, witches, and zombies. I passed several houses decorated with spiders and artificial cobwebs, and saw children happily begging for candy. My love for Halloween was so deep that I even made some candy and started giving it to the kids. But as the night progressed, the streets became quieter and emptier. I decided to go to a more remote place, which was famous for its strange stories of ghosts and otherworldly phenomena. There, according to rumors, something sinister inhabited one of the abandoned houses. Having approached this house, I noticed that its windows were covered with black fabric, and a fire was burning in the yard. Despite the cold, I felt an inner anxiety, but my sense of adventure prevailed. I got out of the car and began to approach the house. Knocking on the door, I heard the creaking of wood and the ominous whisper of the wind. The door suddenly opened, and a figure in a cloak and a demon mask appeared in front of me. My nerves were tense, and I took a step back, but the demon extended his hand and said, "Welcome to the House of Fear." He led me through dark corridors, where black garlands were hung everywhere, and the web of artificial spiders hung over them. Each step filled me with more and more anxiety, and I began to doubt whether this was just a game. Soon the demon opened the door leading to the basement. An atmosphere of complete horror reigned in the basement. Here I saw creepy dolls, vampires, and zombies, and in the corner there was a fire with smoke rising from it. And then something terrible happened. I heard the quiet creak of the door, and someone entered the basement. I turned around and saw a crowd of ghosts, monsters, and the living dead disguised as guests. They began to approach me, laughing and whispering evil spirits. For a moment, my reality disappeared into the darkness of the Halloween night, and I did not know what to do. My heart rate increased and I tried to return to the door I came through, but it suddenly slammed shut, trapping me in this ominous basement. I looked around and noticed that those strange guests that had surrounded me were moving closer, threatening to engulf me in darkness. At that moment, the fire in the center of the room burst into flames, and its light spread throughout the entire basement. In the flickering light, I saw that the real owners of this place were not ghosts and monsters, but living people. They wore black clothes and disguised themselves as monsters to create a mystical atmosphere. Alarmed, I began to fight the feeling of panic when the host of this game stepped forward. He took off his mask and smiled, revealing the host's face with kind eyes. "Sorry for the spookiness, but Halloween without horror isn't really Halloween," he said. "We host this event every year and act out stories to create an unforgettable experience for guests." It turned out that in this strange house, there were people who simply passionately loved Halloween and organized its celebration so realistically that even I, a fan of the holiday, felt really scared. After giving me a pack of chocolates and inviting me to join their mystical party, they let me go. I left there laughing at my own fears and smiling evilly at my naivety. Even though no real ghosts or monsters happened that evening, I will always remember this Halloween as the most unusual and unexpected of my life. Fifth story. It was night when I decided to go on a long journey along the night road, enjoying the silence and darkness that enveloped my car. However, the night promised to not be as calm as I expected. After several hours of serene driving through deserted streets, I noticed two figures standing on the side of the road. Their silhouettes were practically indistinguishable, but as it was clear, they were waiting for someone to help them. And, as often happens on empty roads, I decided to stop and offer them a ride. As soon as they entered the car, I noticed how strange they looked. They were dressed in dark clothes, as if preparing for some special event. Their faces were covered with hoods and strong bags, and their voices seemed completely normal. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to gain some idea about them. "We're just going home," one of the figures replied. "Thanks for stopping." Soon the conversation died down, and a tense silence reigned in the car. I continued driving, feeling their gazes restlessly sliding over my figure. Despite the outward appearance of normality, something about their presence made me feel uncomfortable. After a while, I decided to ask them another question. "What were you doing there on the side of the road at this late hour?" Both figures looked at each other, and their answer was completely incomprehensible. "We were just wandering around." I tried not to think about them and concentrated on the road, but something was bothering me. Soon we approached the village where they were about to leave. "This is our stop," said one of the figures, opening the door and jumping out. As soon as they disappeared into the darkness, I turned around to say goodbye, but all I saw was an empty street. My strange traveling companions disappeared as if they had never existed. The heart of my fear began to beat faster. Where did they disappear to? Was it just my imagination? But they were here in my car, and now they're gone. Under the cover of darkness, on that road, I realized that the world around me could be much more mysterious and scary than I could imagine. Several weeks have passed since I picked up those strange fellow travelers on that night road, but their mysterious disappearance haunted me. I returned to this topic more and more often, trying to solve this puzzle. One day, while reading news on the internet, I accidentally came across an article about missing people in that area. It turned out that several people had disappeared in the last few years, and their disappearance remained an unsolved puzzle for the local police. I decided to contact the local authorities and tell them about my strange encounter. The inspector who took my statement was very interested in my story. He asked many questions, including the location and time of day it happened. A few weeks later, I received a call from the police saying that new evidence had been discovered in the case. Perhaps my travel companions were connected to the disappearances of other people, and my story became the key to solving the puzzle. I agreed to cooperate with the police, and they asked me to accompany them to the site of my last meeting with those mysterious figures. All this filled me with a sense of responsibility and a desire to help solve this mysterious case. When we returned to the place where I picked up our travel companions, we discovered something strange. There were traces of bones and feathers found in the bush slope, and the ground looked like something had been buried there. Each new tiny fact, seemingly unimportant at first glance, added even more mystery to the story. And although the police continued to investigate, many questions remained unanswered. What happened to these strange traveling companions? And were they involved in the disappearances of other people in the area? The secret of these night meetings remained unsolved, and only a mysterious trace in the night remained in my memory. Sixth story: deserted night. The dense atmosphere in the car was suddenly broken. Strange, hissing voices began to be heard from the radio speakers, as if distorted by distortion. A mixture of inarticulate sounds began, and for a few seconds my anxiety went beyond normal. But then, in this atmosphere of tension, I began to distinguish individual words and phrases. "They're getting closer. Look behind you." Mixed predictions of misfortune and threats unfolded before me like something unnatural. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw only the dark road surface, and everything that was behind me was a shadow. My hands began to shake and my pulse quickened. What could this mean? Who or what is they? I felt fear come over me, but despite everything, I decided to remain reasonable. My life and safety were at stake. The voices from the radio continued to whisper predictions of disaster, and I could not turn them off. At the same time, my gaze darted between meters of asphalt, the approaching darkness, and the radio, which became more and more alarming. Suddenly, in the distance on the road, I saw the faint light of flashing headlights. Something was approaching from behind, and it was difficult to determine. Under the pressure of fear, I decisively accelerated the speed of the car, hoping to get away from this mysterious pursuit. The words and sounds from the radio still bombarded me, but I was determined to keep moving forward. Despite this, the headlights from behind were getting closer and closer, and fear took over me completely. I turned on my emergency lights and prayed that someone close to me would fly past me and then stop. But strange voices from the radio continued to predict something terrible, waiting for me on this deserted road. The headlights behind my car became brighter, and the engine noise of an approaching car sounded like a threatening roar. All my senses were strained to the limit when suddenly a truck drove along the side of the road, illuminating the road in front of it with powerful headlights. The moment of panic gave way to relief, and I convinced myself that it was just a truck driver who just wanted to pass me. He posed no danger, and I felt safe. But when the truck passed me, I felt a cold pierce my body. Suddenly, it dawned on me. It was the same truck that was on the low bridge, and it was following me. She braked and began to approach, her headlights illuminating the back of my car. All the voices from the radio stopped, and I felt waves of cold rolling over my skin. What did they want? What happened on the low bridge? These questions flashed through my mind, but I couldn't let them overwhelm me. With panic in my voice, I called the police and told them what was happening. They said they would send a patrol to the scene. Suddenly, the truck accelerated sharply and slid past me, and I heard the driver's laughter, which was mixed with frightening sounds. The police arrived a few minutes later, but the truck had disappeared, leaving me in darkness and vague anxiety. They began an investigation and listened to recordings from the radio in my car, but did not find anything strange there. That night seemed to be just a strange work of my imagination, but I still could not forget the feeling of imminent danger and ominous predictions coming from the radio. Many questions remained unanswered, and I was left with the dark feeling that on that night road I had touched something that was not intended for the human world. Seventh story. My terrible experience begins with this story. I was on a long night drive, and my car was slowly sliding down the empty road. The clock was already showing midnight, and I was starting to feel tired. But what happened next was not at all like ordinary fatigue from a long journey. The dense darkness of the night surrounded me, and the car was the only source of light on this deserted road. Suddenly, I noticed something strange. Fog, mystical and dense, began to accumulate around the road. He appeared, it seemed, out of nowhere, as if summoned by some invisible force. At first I didn't attach any importance to this, thinking that it was just ordinary fog that happens on night roads. But when the car plunged into this darkness, I felt that something was wrong. My headlights couldn't penetrate the thick fog, and I quickly became disorientated. The world around me seemed to disappear, and I was left in darkness. Attempts to turn around and go back were unsuccessful, because the whole world around me was uniformly white and silent. Doubts began to creep into my soul and fear began to overwhelm me. I felt that I was no longer in the reality in which my journey began. And suddenly, as at the moment of teleportation, everything around me will change. My headlights penetrated the fog and I saw another world. It was unsteady and mystical, as if from a dream. The trees seemed to lean towards the ground, and their branches formed strange patterns in the sky. And before me soared terrible shadows and ghosts, floating in this world like flames. Fear took hold of me, and I began to panic, trying to figure out where I was and how to get back. But nothing helped. My phone was useless. The signal was gone. I was locked in this mystical reality, which seemed like a world of nightmares and dreams. What awaited me in this strange world? And how can I get out of this nightmare? Rescue, if possible at all, seemed increasingly distant and uncertain. I felt fear tightening my chest, and I tried to control my panic. Strange shadows and ghosts continued to soar into the sky, creating mysterious patterns. The feeling of being trapped between worlds became increasingly intrusive. Slowly, I continued to move forward along this mystical road. My car seemed to glide along it, as if floating in an ocean of invisible force. The faint glow from the shadows and ghosts created a frightening and colorful landscape, and I could not take my eyes off this nightmare. After some time, I saw something that looked like an old, abandoned house. He stood on the shore of a dark lake, and the light of the lantern looked like the only invitation into this house. I didn't want to go there, but I had no choice. I stopped the car and got out. The minute my foot touched the ground, I felt the fog around me begin to burn my skin like acid. My steps were unsteady, and I could barely move. I entered the house, and there I was overcome by a feeling of antiquity and abandonment. The door closed behind me with a loud creak, and I realized that I was locked here. Icy hands of fear squeezed my chest when I heard whispers and rustling coming from the depths of the house. I didn't know what awaited me inside, but one thing was clear. This was a world of nightmares, and I was its prisoner. Eighth story. It was a dark and hopelessly empty night when I set out in my car along a forgotten road that seemed endless. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and only distant rays of light created ghostly images of the trees around me. After some time, I saw a woman standing in the middle of the road. She was dressed in an old-fashioned dress, as if from the time of the last century. She looked so real that it didn't even occur to me that she might be a ghost. I stopped the car, thinking she needed help. Carefully getting out of the car, I approached her and asked, "Do you need help? Are you okay?" She silently nodded her head, and I decided to walk her across the road. As I raised my hand to support her, I felt a coldness on her skin, like the frosty breath of death. But that didn't scare me. I thought she was just scared and needed support. We began to cross the road, and at some point she suddenly stopped and turned to me. Her eyes were restless and empty, and I felt uneasy. "What's happened?" I asked, looking around nervously. That's when she began to change before my eyes. Her skin began to slowly fade, as if crawling inside her, and her figure disappeared into the darkness of the night. I jumped back in horror, but it was already too late. She disappeared, and I began to look into the empty night, realizing that I had just witnessed something incredible. As if I had seen the light, I returned to my car and tried to get off this damn road. But since then I know that the night brought me something sinister and irreversible. She left me with a fear that will not go away, and the knowledge that the worlds of ghosts and souls of the dead are real, and they can catch us when we least expect it. Since then, that night has forever left its mark on my soul. I could no longer sleep peacefully, always expecting that the ghosts might come back and consume me. My friends declared me crazy when I told them this story, and I decided not to share it with anyone else. Every night when I close my eyes, I see the face of that woman, her empty eyes, and the flicker of darkness that swallowed her. It has become part of my daily nightmare, and I no longer know restful sleep. At night, I sometimes see ghosts slowly approaching my bed, as if rising from hell to return what was taken from them. I'm afraid that one day they will really come for me to make me part of their world. That night changed me forever, and now I know that there are things that are better left alone. But fear always haunts me, reminding me that the world of ghosts and souls of the dead may be closer than we think. Ninth story. This story happened to me several years ago, but every time I remember it, I am overcome with a chill of fear. That night forever left its imprint on my memory. It was a dark, threatening night as I returned home from a long road trip. The road was empty and I felt tired and exhausted. I was approaching a bridge that led to a remote village when I suddenly saw a gloomy van in the distance. The van was black and covered in mud, as if it had just been pulled out of the deepest ditch. He moved slowly along the road, and it seemed to me that he was moving too slowly for a night road. But what really struck me was the terrible scream that came from the van. It was a scream of horror, as if someone inside the van was experiencing indescribable pain and horror. Fear welled up in my stomach, but what could I do but follow this gloomy vehicle to make sure everything was okay? Gradually, the van got closer and the screams became louder. I decisively overtook him to look at the driver. But when I looked in his direction, I saw only a gloomy silhouette in a mask, which seemed to be ignoring me. And then something strange happened. The van suddenly disappeared, as if it had suddenly evaporated. And the screams stopped. I stopped the car and got out to look at the road, but there was no longer any sign of the van. Mixed feelings of fear and bewilderment overwhelmed me. What was it? Who was screaming inside the dark van? And why did he disappear so suddenly? I still haven't found the answers to these questions. That night remains a mystery that still haunts my nightmares. No one would have believed this story if I had not experienced this moment of horror myself. Since then, that night has become something that haunts me. I spent countless hours trying to find some answers to my questions. The locals to whom I told this story looked at me as if I was crazy and claimed that they had never seen any gloomy van on that road. However, I was convinced that what I saw and heard was real. At night, I often saw in my dreams the face of the one screaming from the van, and this face radiated despair and pain. I decided to conduct my own investigation to try to find at least some traces of this mysterious story. I soon discovered that the locals tended to believe in the legend of the spirit of the road, which they said could appear to drivers and mislead them. Legend has it that the spirit of the road disappears instantly, leaving drivers in a state of shock and fear. It appears exclusively at night and is said to be related to an unfortunate incident that occurred on this road many years ago. Thus, I realized that my impressions could be related to this mystical creature. But this did not reduce my fear and bewilderment at what was happening. The mystery remained a mystery, and I realized that maybe some things are just better left unsolved. 10th story. It was at night, after a hard day at work, when I returned to my car in the parking lot. For a moment, my fatigue faded when I discovered that something was wrong with my phone. The screen was lit up and a strange video was playing on it. My heart started beating faster when I saw that the video was of my own car. I was standing in the parking lot, but what was happening inside made me feel like I was in a nightmare. I was sitting in the back seat of my car. I looked at the screen in bewilderment, but fear began to take over me when I realized that this was the past. The man in the video was sitting exactly like me at that moment. He looked worried and scared, just like I was feeling right now. He started talking to someone off camera, but I couldn't make out the words. He suddenly turned around, and his face froze in a moment filled with fear. It was too weird to be just a video recording. I felt that the video conveyed something more sinister than just the past. I felt like someone or something was watching me and trying to send me some kind of message. I decided to go back to the car and sit in the back seat where the video showed my past self. I felt stupid doing this, but the fear was too strong to ignore. As soon as I got into the back seat, something drowned me out and made me turn around to see my own face, contorted in fear. I realized that the me in the video saw me now, and his face was not only full of horror, but also an arrogant smile. At that moment, I realized that it was a warning and that someone or something was watching me. I realized that I needed to be careful because something mysterious and sinister was nearby, and it knew that I was watching the video. Fear took over me completely when I realized that this was not just a video of the past, but something much more sinister and terrible. My own face in the video continued to grin, and I felt it looming over me, as if penetrating my soul. I was a prisoner of a terrible nightmare version of myself. Suddenly, the police commander appeared in the headlights in front of my car. He told me to get out of the car and get away from her. I obeyed his order, and getting out of the car, I turned around and saw my car burst into bright flames. The policeman said it was a random incident and that someone had thrown an incendiary device at my car. I told him about the strange video and what I saw on the screen, but he looked at me like I was crazy. He claimed that there was nothing like that in the video and that it was just a random incident. However, I was sure that I had seen something else, something that was much darker and more dangerous than just a fire. I realized that I was left in the shadow of some mystical threat, and my life would no longer be the same. From then on, I tried to remain vigilant and attentive, for I knew that something sinister was watching me and wanted to convey its fear to me. My world became darker and more uncertain, and I was no longer sure what was real and what was a nightmare.